So, welcome everyone to Validity of Public Opinion Polling. So, I'm glad you're here, and I actually am glad that it's a fairly small group. There's what, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 of us, including Roger on Zoom, to be able to talk about this. I have designed this with a combination of video and PowerPoints, but I want to stop as we go and talk about it. So I think everyone will have an idea of some things they want to talk about here. Just as a brief introduction, my name's Lynn Randall. I spent my career pretty much as a public opinion researcher, initially in political polling back in the days of the Reagan administration. I worked for President Reagan. And later, my focus went towards market research. And I had clients who asked me to start my own company, so I started a boutique market research firm. My clients always came with me or brought me with them when they changed businesses, and I never had to look for clients. And so it was a good gig, and I enjoyed it. I learned a lot. I love market research because I love finding out why people do things. So there's a big social scientist inside of me. So I'd like to start today by going around the room. I'm curious whether you've used market research or participated in market research studies, and what do you hope to get out of today's course? So Roger, I'll start with you. You'll have to, there you go.
Thank you. Good to see you by Zoom. I have seen a great deal of market research over the years, and especially now in the Blitz over the last month. And I hope to learn more about the methods, and then later on ask you a couple of questions at the appropriate point in your presentation.
Perfect. Okay. Doug, how about you?
So I used to work at the Maryland Innovation Center, and we did a market research program. We had a certain mix of clients, and they all looked like overweight males. And so we wanted to understand why we weren't getting across, so we did a market, we hired a company to go out.
Did you do market research for your clients as well, or help them do that?
Me, no.
Okay. Okay. And have you ever participated in market research, in a poll?
Yeah, no, I've been called back in the days when I had a landline phone, asked all kinds of questions.
Okay. How about you, Kathy?
Well, when I was an editor for a business publication, sometimes we would cover different polls themselves. And then I participate in several online polls.
Great.
I didn't do anything that had anything to do with market research. I've just gotten really hooked on the political process and constant citing of polls. And I wanted, and we all know that the 2016 poll was not predictive at all, and neither was the 2020. And so I just wondered why. This did answer some of those
Okay.
questions. I don't participate in polls because I don't answer the phone when I don't recognize the number. And the Republican Party sends polls to our house only addressed to my husband, and we're both registered Republicans, and that makes us both so mad that we don't answer.
I can't say I blame you. I probably do the same thing. Teresa, how about you?
Well, I had nothing to do with polls before, or opinion polls. So I never worked for anybody who did. So, but I have done 1 or 2 polls, but it's been a couple of years. I don't answer the phone.
Okay. David.
I have very limited background in marketing, but I do work in political campaigns, so I kind of live and breathe polling. I also follow them, but they're fascinating. I really get turned off at the end of the poll. It says send money. But this is really very timely and topical, and it's a fascinating. Then real quickly, I was amazed at how it's evolved over time.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. Between going from landlines to cell phones, so it's just like a moving target. No real fun.
I know, it makes me feel old realizing that all that change happened.
You're a veteran. You're not old. You're a veteran.
Joanne, how about you?
Well, I'm pretty much on board with Nancy and David. Is that I had no experience with using market research, no matter I had to use it for anything.
But because of the current political atmosphere that we live in, I want to know, how do they make a poll valid? How many people do you need to have in your poll? What kind of questions are they asking to make this poll valid, and where do they come from? So, yeah, it's just the gestalt background of it.
Perfect. Well, I think hopefully you'll get that from us. Jackie?
I've not been involved in opinion polling. I have answered landline calls on a couple of online, but I'm more skeptical about online stuff because you don't know who's conducting the poll and you don't know how your data are going to be used. And inevitably you start getting mails asking for money. And so that all makes me very nervous. And so now I don't do any online stuff. Polls.
So did you not answer our request for responses to our poll, the Chesapeake Forum poll?
I did, but see,
We didn't answer them, yes.
but I knew who was doing it. And when you get these opinion polls, you don't know what's a reputable company, and all the candidates are sending texts and emails asking for money, and you don't know where that's going to. Exactly.
So Annabelle, what about you? I kind of coerced you into doing this class, but I know you like current events.
Yeah, I have no prior experience with polls. I never used it in my career. Statistics, I read professional articles that employ statistics, but and I had one semester of statistics, which makes me nothing.
So, well, I can understand the statistics part. I always hire people, statisticians, to do that for me. So, Bob, what about you?
Okay. My first experience with market research was in 1987 when a large international company asked me to do the analysis of market research that they had conducted. I was a newbie, wasn't a marketing person, not a market researcher. I was asked to look at the data and make a recommendation. Over the years, Lynn asked me to help with some of the projects with a market research company. My first project for her was, God, I forget the name of the company. It was about color imaging for radiologists.
Yes.
It's a premium internet company.
Yeah.
And then when I retired again, Lynn asked me to get more involved in some of the healthcare market research that we do. I remember the most challenging one to me was before I really understood next-gen sequencing, genomic sequencing. And that was a tough one because I was the guy who was on the phone with researchers all over the globe asking them tough questions about really leading edge. I digress. I'm a member of a YouGov poll. I think I've been invited to that panel because I'm a registered libertarian and I'm neither Republican or Democrat. And I get, like this last week, I answered 4 polls. 3 of them were issue polls. One was head-to-head. And they never asked questions about my party's candidate, Chase Oliver. And so I think for me, I guess the question I want to get out of this is, do public polls, do these polls really mean anything to us as voters seriously? Or are they just tools for the candidates? My opinion is I don't pay attention to them because voodoo magic is really dedicated, I think, to the people running for public office.
Okay, so I can tell I'm going to need to use my cane.
I know.
Bob. So, okay, Bob.
Shut up, Bob.
So, we're married, so I can get away with that. But there's some of the things that you've all mentioned, I think we will talk on today, but if I forget and you see that a good place for it to come up, just ask the question. So I'm going to start here, and Trina, I wanted to start with this. This is a poll that was done in the UK, but it really addresses why do we need polls very nicely. So if we can go ahead and run this.
That's opinion polls. We better know what that.
Volume has to go up.
Why are we?
It's probably the sound on your computer.
You know what? We haven't done this for so long. I bet the settings jumped back. Give me a second,
We have come a long way since our first Zoom sessions that we did 4 years ago. Think about how many of us were not even able to get on to Zoom.
Yep, it
And
jumped
now
back
we just
to,
routinely use classrooms.
hope it fixed that.
Yes.
Without opinion polls, we'd never know what everyone else in the country thinks before and during an election. Just imagine a world for a moment where we didn't have opinion polls at all. Anyone, any politician, could say what they liked pretty much about how popular they are and what concerns voters. They'd have to base that on pretty sketchy evidence. So, carefully conducted insights into what the country thinks of value. Right now, one of the top issues is the NHS, including dental care. Polls tell politicians which problems are cutting through. And if they ignore those issues, it's at their peril. They look out of touch. Polls also tell the media which parties need to be represented in their election coverage. So we need opinion polls, but can we trust them? They do tend to be pretty good at what they do. They also become more predictive of the election the closer we get to it, as we ourselves make up our minds about who to vote for. How do polls work? Pollsters take a sample, usually around 1,000 people, and they make sure their sample is as good a match as possible to the UK demographic as a whole, typically conducting interviews online, sometimes on the phone. The key to a good poll is the quality of the sample, how well it matches the makeup of the UK, not the number of people interviewed. You may see a poll on social media. The problem then is that all of those answers could be from one niche group who pretty much think the same thing. Polling companies commit to transparency and codes of conduct. The key thing with looking at opinion polls, and there are loads coming out at the moment, is to wait to see the signal that emerges rather than the inevitable noise. You wait to see the pattern, not focus on one individual poll. The following graph shows how Labour and Conservative support has changed in opinion polls since 2019. And lately, polls are using this up-to-date information to estimate how our votes will translate into seats or constituency results. They do that because we know what kinds of things predict people's vote choice and how those factors play out across all different constituencies. Those statistical methods currently point to large majorities for Labour in this election. So this map from 2019 would be turning a lot more red. Polls can influence how some people vote, or indeed whether they vote at all. For example, the result could look so obvious that some people just don't bother. But there are reasons to be careful with this. Polls don't always get things exactly right. And strong support in a poll doesn't always mean a party gets the largest number of MPs. In our system, smaller parties have to concentrate their support in constituencies just to get one MP, whereas large parties have to spread their vote widely. Geography also matters, and that pattern is only clear once everyone has voted. Many people take the local race into account, who has the best chance of winning in their constituency. And you can see here in 2019, around 15% of people said that they voted for a party because the party they preferred didn't have a chance of winning in their constituency. If you want to take this into account, you might look at the national polls, but you should also look at recent results where you live. So polling is useful if you know how to use polls. But at the end of the day, what really matters is the general election result itself.
I wish I could be that concise. But when you think about it, she raised a lot of the same issues that they have in the UK that we have here. One of them was that mention about voting because they didn't think their party could possibly win. So, and doesn't that sound a lot like some of the things you heard people say about the Trump versus Clinton or Trump versus, you sit there and go, well, it's the lesser of two evils or whatever kind of a thing. Mm-hmm. So there are a lot of nuances to polls, and one of them, one of the other ones was she was talking about issues, and the reason why those polls are so important is because they tell the news media and the politicians what are the issues that people care about so that they can be paying attention to those issues. And I think a finding in this year, in 2024, I'm seeing a lot more of that, where they're showing how people perceive the different candidates across some of these different issues that have been identified as important to people. And I think that's helpful. They also talked about how polls will help the media figure out which politicians to be following, because, usually we have a different sort of thing than we have this year. Usually there's this big run up of 19 or 20 running for the Republican ticket, or another group running for the Democrat ticket. So it all kind of filters out, and it helps the news media, I think, understand what they should be paying attention to by talking to people. What were some other things that you garnered from that video? Yes, Bob?
The most important poll is election day.
Okay,
Or at least that's the one that counts.
yes, that's the one that counts, yeah.
Well, she talked about having the polling go around the country, not just in the most populated
The geographies and
zones, the other areas. So it's the demographics, but not to cover everything.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, that's the interesting thing to me, because in the old days, when we all had landline phones, it seemed like that was a way to get to every household. But now, it's like, because they even said, right, they do mostly online, but some of them they call. Like, how do they figure that out? And how do they make sure they're getting balanced? For me, that seems to be an awful big challenge.
Well, we'll be talking about that, so if I don't address that issue, bring it up again, okay?
And how do they know that they're getting the full spectrum of the population rather than a certain sector?
Well, when we had landline phones, you could tell where it was coming from, but now that we have mobile phones and you carry your number wherever you go, wherever you move, it makes it harder to determine.
It definitely does.
I'm trying to remember, I took a British politics course about 150 years ago, so my memory may be a little stale here. But I seem to recall the prime minister over gets elected by the majority of parliament. They don't actually have the head of state run for president like we do. So what I got from that was their polling a little different. They're more focused on
Getting representatives
in the parliament, and then that settles as opposed to ours, we can vote for president independently.
Right.
Republicans can lose the Senate, lose the House, win the White House. There's all kinds of permutations, but that was one thing I noticed, that they're still a parliamentary system
Yes.
as opposed to us.
Any
I think.
Any other comments from this? Shall we move on?
I love what I said, right?
It's kind of interesting that we mentioned two political parties, Labor and Conservatives.
Oh, yeah, because they have many, don't they?
How do they do public polling in Italy with 11 major parties? Forget about the minor parties, 11 major parties.
Well, we'll be talking about that, because that has to do with your margin of error and how that would impact being able to look at the different groups of people. So.
Bob raises a good point too. And in Britain, as I recall, the Conservative Party is very well defined as conservative, obviously. The Labour Party is very carefully defined. So in a sense, it's a little easier to pick who you're going to vote for because you know what you're getting. Here we've got splits within both parties. Conservative wing, liberal wing, middle wing. It's gotten a little more divisive, but still, parties aren't clearly defined like they are, I don't think, in Britain. So that makes a difference too.
Well, and our parties historically have changed a lot.
Yes, they have.
And what used to be the Republican Party is now Democratic versus vice versa. So it's kind of hard to keep up with all that. So why do we have polls? And one of the things that I found interesting was that polls actually used to be back in the 1800s. It was like the word poll is a synonym for head. So it was like counting heads. How many are in favor, and that type of a thing. So the polls were used to gauge public sentiment. Before they would go off and do something, they would kind of stand in the square, I guess, and ask all the people who came for the discussion. What do you think? So today we use polls to count heads too. It's just we do it a lot more scientifically. Well, or so we think. This isn't moving.
Yeah, I was afraid of that.
Oh,
It should work now.
Okay, so I think, Bob, you mentioned that the real poll is with election day. And so that's a one perspective. Don't elections tell us what the public wants? But here are some of the problems. Elections, president, for example, don't tell us why people voted for the candidate. And of course, as we've already discussed, there could be a lot of people who voted for one candidate because they didn't want the other candidate. That is plain and simple. So it doesn't tell you a whole lot. And they don't tell us whether people agree with all of the different things that policies that candidate is proposing. Because there's usually a whole slew of them. And some of them you might think, oh, that's a great idea. And then no one might come and go, oh, I don't know that. So it can be frustrating. And that simple vote doesn't tell you everything. But the other thing that's really significant is that even in a high turnout year, a third or more of the public does not vote.
It's astounding.
Yeah, so it's not, that vote is not representative of what everybody wants or thinks. So that's where we start looking at, I guess you'll have to do it.
Oh, it's still?
No. So another method that people use to have their voice heard, and we see this a lot here in this small community, is community participation. So citizens like us can go to the town council meetings, or we can go to the planning commission meetings or the county meetings, and we can voice an opinion. And oftentimes, the people who have the biggest voice are the ones who are going to shape what happens. It's really rather astounding to me, because I keep thinking, wouldn't it be a good idea if you guys just did some sort of survey and would go to people beyond the people who sit in the community gallery every time? And here's the other part of that problem, is that the people who go to these meetings tend to be people like us, older people, more highly educated, more affluent, and we're not representative of everyone in this county, especially not the workers in this county. So that becomes a potential problem.
Lynn, try turning it off and back on. It may have gone to sleep because of the video.
Okay,
Yeah, slide it back.
okay, I turned it off, I'm turning it on. Oh, now the little button came on. Oh yeah, there we go.
It goes to sleep too fast.
I thought you would enjoy this little cartoon. Those of you who remember history. And then
We're not that.
yes.
We heard about it.
Yeah, so, and there are other presidential elections where that happened. Some of you might remember some. Do you remember?
I'm sorry.
Was it one of the Roosevelts that everyone thought was going to win? They even had the newspapers.
It was this one.
There was another one too, and I can't recall.
Clinton, Trump the first time around.
Well, yeah, I missed that one, yeah. I don't know if the newspapers printed the headline already.
Nobody reads it anyway, so it doesn't matter.
Yeah, they
We had one Bush and Gore that came down a few votes.
That's true too, yeah.
Yeah.
So how are polls better? So polls, and we've touched on this a little bit, we'll touch a lot more because I'm going to talk more about how polls are done. In fact, I think I missed the intro page. Did I skip over that?
Well, there's polling about issues, and then there's polling about which candidate you favor.
True,
And yeah.
yeah, so here, I forgot to cover this slide, what we'll be covering today. So why is public opinion polling important? That's where we are right now. And under that, I'm going to be talking about polling basics. So I'm going to give you the 20-minute synopsis of the basic things about polling and how it's done. And then why the skepticism about poll results? And then finally, can we believe polls? And are opinion polls valid today? So, okay, now we'll skip that forward. And cover off. So yes, so rigorous polls can overcome those representation limitations. So we will talk about, I don't know if this poll that I'm participating is representative, or is it just me? It used to be people with telephones, when it was all telephone polling, people would say, well, they know never calls me, so I don't know how these could be representative. And then now with the online polls, they're actually more representative because these others, we'll talk about the sampling procedures here in a minute, but the online polls are actually better and getting close to what the actual reality is. So a good poll gives everyone in the population an equal voice, not just those with the loudest voices. And when you think about it, so the American population is huge. You couldn't possibly talk to everybody. So you have to come up with sampling techniques that randomize and make it so that you've got a reasonable reason to believe that you are getting to a representative universe of people to talk to that would be very close to what you would get if you did talk to everybody. So that's where polling has come out and why sampling is so critical to the process. Can polls do harm? Well, yes, they can. Some of you can probably think of some examples. David, how have you seen a poll do some harm?
Oh, countless times. I've heard people say that to me, why bother? It's all over the shouting and it's frustrating.
Yeah.
Example, I'm trying to think of one,
Well, let's say for example,
Larry Hogan versus Angela Hasselbrook's. All the polling is showing that Angela Hasselbrook's central candidate, Maryland, is going to beat Larry Hogan. And I'm hearing people say, there's no point in voting for Larry because it's not going to make a difference.
The push polls, I'm looking at 538 right now. They've got Angela ahead by 8 points. So.
only 8
say,
points.
Why bother?
13.
Libertarians, why should we even go to polls
Right.
in the United States?
Okay,
Well, and exit polls on the day you vote, I think these days they don't release the results
There's-
until
yes.
everybody's closed.
yes, they've been.
California, why bother
That was an
voting?
issue
Yeah.
that years
That's
ago.
an issue.
Yeah.
I remember Gore versus Bush, where the people in the panhandle of Florida were seeing the predictions that Gore had won. And there was a sense that maybe those people stayed at home, didn't even buy the go vote because they said it was all over. Now, I think the networks have finally pulled back on that.
They have,
But that
they
was
have.
that was a real problem back then. As close as that election was, every vote literally counted. Every vote, whether or not you agree with the outcome, it was.
Well, and
That
did they
was
stop
over.
doing, I'm sorry,
Go ahead.
did they stop doing that because now there's early voting? Because I don't remember there being early voting.
I think the
years
news
ago.
media put their heads together and decided, no, we don't want to be influencing the vote. And they found that they and politicians.
Actually, if they hold suspense longer, you get more commercials on TV.
Watch for longer.
That's
I
right.
don't know where the mute button is very
There
well.
you go.
And early voting varies by state. And, so it's not a national guarantee.
Right, because I saw, I have
When we
here,
were-
it starts on the 24th.
Well, and when I was in the military, people overseas would be voting and their votes would come in, but they wouldn't even bother to count them if there wasn't a large enough margin that there'd be of any value adding them in. So that's a
I
frustration.
would have been curious during the primary season this year to see what the polling was like against Liquor Store Boy against Angela Also Works. He's got $60 million.
Yes.
Yeah, he did a lot
For
of
months
media.
and months and months.
Yeah.
I couldn't pick her out of a police lineup.
Right.
So how did that happen?
That wasn't a vote, was it?
Oh, no. How did that, seriously, how did that happen? In just a matter of 3 or 4 weeks.
And he was an incumbent member of Congress too, so he
He was
was
a member of the House.
visibility
Yes.
by virtue of his position.
Maybe people got tired of his ads. Anyway,
Yeah.
so,
They get tired of his money that he spent, that was part of it, I think it was a real
He's got
backlash,
60 million.
millions and millions he put into that race.
Yeah, but he had a lot of political support from the top people in the Democratic Party and, Montgomery County,
Prince
Prince
George's
County,
County.
Baltimore,
Right.
I just-
dominated the voting in Maryland, so.
But there,
Well, I'm saying, if he was ahead in the polls by 20 points, how did that shift in such
I
a
don't,
short period?
isn't that, in the poll?
so
I don't know.
one of the things here, that actually is more meaningful, I think, on the right-hand side than on the left was rumor control. So a poll a poll could actually be used to create rumors and promote rumors versus fact. If somebody really wanted to do that. And we have, and there's really nothing that would keep anybody from doing that if they're paying for it. So basically I know that you've all talked about how the polling and hearing the results might make people stay home. The converse could also be true, I suppose, that it would make more people come out if their candidate was behind. The actual outcome of an election can be significantly different from what the polls say. I'm not sure that that's harmful. It's just that something was off in the polls. Some poll questions might affect how people think about the issues. Now that is an awful lot of time in polling. The client that is paying for the poll will want to not just have the question, but they want to frame the question. And a pollster, person writing the questionnaire usually works to combat that. If anything, they would put a rather benign intro in case, so that if people didn't understand what the issue was, because in the issue polling, that sometimes you're asking for opinions about something they don't know anything about, right? So that can be a problem. But polls can also, this is one of the things that I would kind of highlight, is that polls can also give people a realistic view of what others think, which can, I would think, minimize some of the partisan polarization that we have in the world today. I would hope. But it's very frustrating to hear all these different views, but it's nice when they're reporting on what everyone thinks about the views.
I find a certain amount of skepticism. If you're going to listen to the poll that CNN did, or the one that Fox did, or the one that ABC did, I just think that the questions that they might be asking are favorable to their point of view.
I think that's a very good skepticism to have. The only way that you can combat that, and he's tweeting, the only way that you can combat that is to dig into it and see the poll itself. And you can actually find these polls, especially on the major ones like ABC, Washington Post is one of the major pollsters. And they're very careful in towing the line and not being, putting enough, and keeping their questions, good questions. But you can easily go online to find the poll and find the top line and find out how they did it.
Well, do they tell you the questions that they ask?
Yeah, they should. For those larger polls, they do.
Yeah.
Pew Research always does. They always insert a link where you can go directly to the background of the poll, and you can see who is included and how, you can even see how they weighted it.
I've done 4 polls this week. The 3 of them were issue polls. And as I went through the issue polls, I was thinking to myself, I wonder who their client was. With that said, the questions were really well written. They were fair balanced.
Now that was with YouGov, right?
It was with YouGov.
And YouGov is one of the top 5 pollsters at the moment. And so, and that's rated based on how good their polling results are. But it's also rated that they are willing to they belong to APOR, and they provide all of their information to APOR. And that's like having a medical journal peer reviewing your work to make sure it's being done correctly. So
Interesting though, because when I've been asked to take polls, I'm not aware that they've told me who's conducting the poll.
that's what the value of online polls.
I'm thinking who it was. They didn't say who was.
Yeah. So, yeah, I mean, you can sort of tell maybe by how objective or the questions are, how impartial and how they're worded, but I'm just always hesitant because I don't know who's doing the poll and how how good it is a good use of my time.
Yeah, I'm trying to
And
think.
how do you look at it if you don't, how do you go and?
So some of those online, there are different ways of contacting people to participate in the poll. Most of these political polls are being done using panels. So Bob belongs to a panel.
Right.
But to collect people because the panels are constantly refreshing. They drop people out who are participating. They drop people out who say 55555 instead of thinking about the questions. They drop people out. They bring in people that represent a group of people that aren't clearly represented in their panel. So they're constantly double checking, making sure they have current emails and all these sorts of things on people. And so that's why the panels they identify themselves when you participate in one of those. That when you get a panel that pops up on your screen when you're on the internet, for example, that one is probably being done by who knows who. And those are the ones where you're typically going to be asked to donate or donate to our cause or donate to whatever. And so those are the ones that, you probably would want to avoid those, but the ones that are good quality, who's behind the poll. You don't know who the client is, but you know who's doing the poll.
They do a tricky thing too in terms of determining if I'm a likely voter, because they ask me.
So Bob, I'd like you to hold on to that thought because we're going to be talking about that a little bit later.
I have a question. When the panel is assembled, you run the risk of self-selection. You only get the people who really are either loud or interested. How random is that?
That's another thing we'll be talking about and so remember that question because when they talk about the different methods that they're using for research now, that's one of the reasons why they are selecting people. What they're doing is, just hold on.
I'm sorry.
So I dropped this in here because I wanted you to remember that there are political polling is a very small subset to all of the polling and public opinion market research that's being done in the world. So my research the bulk of it was market research. I was in that group where I helped businesses succeed in a competitive marketplace. I was doing product development and is there some problem? Or did Roger drop out?
I think you just dropped out.
Okay. So they're doing product development, identifying wants and needs of key constituents, strategic planning, things like that. So, but political polling, here it is. Political polling is a small but lucrative and influential subset of public opinion, and oftentimes it's done by some of these same organizations, or it's being done by universities, and they're looking for what they are trying to do is use their success in political polling as a reason to be donating to them and paying, sending kids to their school or whatever. It's a more broad reason for doing it. But anyone doing public opinion research is bound by two large professional organizations, APOR, which stands for the Public Opinion Research American Association for Public Opinion Research, and CASRO, Code of Standards and Ethics for Survey Research. So even me, with a small boutique market research firm, I had to follow the rules. I always got clients wanting to know, well, can you give me the list of people who said yes to this? No, I can't. Or once you recruit somebody, can we send them information about them? No, you can't. So you can't without their permission. So sometimes I would ask the people who provided the sample if they would kindly go back and ask if the respondents would be willing to get this information, but they would send it, not the client. So that's probably the biggest hurdle you get with being a public opinion practitioner.
Question, and I don't want to be disrespectful, but since all are bound by the same professional expert, is it members of these two groups or is it I can see it.
It should be anyone who's got their shingle out doing market research.
And what are the penalties if they don't follow professional? I'm trying to be difficult.
They would probably, they would probably, if they were members of an organization, it'd be kicked out of the organization.
So I guess my point is, as a consumer, either marketing, political, we should check and see if they're a member of this
You could do that,
organization.
yeah.
So the
Yeah.
litmus
I know
test,
that-
at least get some idea of how.
At the end, I have a slide of the top 5, and I know all of those are members of both. Pew Research is a member of both. All of the really large public opinion research firms are members of those organizations. And after the 2020 election, the APOR brought a group of them together to basically, okay, what happened here? Why is this a problem? How do we fix this problem? So yes, those are, but the whole point of this is that polling is just a really small part of what everybody's doing in terms of seeking to understand why people do what they do.
So for polling for presidential races, do they take into account, because the electoral college kind of screws it up in the sense that it's not, I mean, I don't know, negative or positive, but it messes with the numbers not being pure. Do they take that into account?
I don't think they do when they are balancing, balancing against a benchmark. That's for a candidate's group, because the candidates do that. So they're the ones who focus on the states where there's a chance to win or will get them to the electoral college.
So if like the ABC Washington poll says Trump is ahead, that's in normal voting,
Well,
not
you'll see this, that in fact, 2016 was not off. It was, for the national polling, it was correct.
Right.
So that's the interesting part of that, is that everyone thought it was wrong, but it really wasn't, because she won the popular vote. So we have another video. I'm not sure.
Every election cycle, hours of coverage are devoted to who's up and who's down in the latest polling. The candidates at last night's debate had to achieve a certain amount of support from multiple electoral polls. CBS News Executive Director of Elections and Surveys, Anthony Salvanto, joins us now to explain how those polls are created and what you should pay attention to when you're looking at the results. Hey, Anthony.
Hey there, Scott. Yes, it is that special time of year. I'm talking, of course, about seeing all these poll numbers coming out. And look, in this episode of our Polling Explainers, we're talking specifically about the likely voter, just in time, of course, for voting to start up, and about how it makes the polls you're about to watch so different. So I want to start with this. If I were to put up a poll about your attitudes or your personal situation, people see that and they nod, okay, that's interesting. But when I put up a poll like this one with a horse race, now the fireworks start. It always spurs debate. Some people go, oh, my side's winning. Some people say, no, that can't be right. And hold on a second. The fact is, people do look at election polls a little differently because there's rooting interest, small differences of 1 or 2 points can change the whole narrative, but mostly because this contains a behavioral component. That is, what people are going to do, in this case vote, or not do, and that's built in. So that's when we start talking about the likely voter. By the way, this happens in business. It happens around the world every day. Some people might like the new car in the ad they see, but will they buy it? It's an economic question. Consumer confidence might be up, but will people spend money? These are all things we have to deal with. So in the elections world, the likely voter estimate is often a reason why one poll can be different from another. Most polls start this by asking people, straightforward, okay, how likely are you to vote in the election? This can rule out some people who aren't likely, and the people who say they're very likely, very often, actually do show up. The ones in the middle here can be a little more marginal. So one of the things we can do is look at what people have done in the past. This becomes an important part of ours and other likely voter models. If you look on a public voter file and you see, for example, that people have voted in, let's say, the last 2 elections, 2018, 2020, and 90% of them then voted in the subsequent, say, midterm after that, you can give that person in the poll a weight, a likely voter weight, of 0.9. That reflects their generalizable chance of showing up based on past behavior. But that might be different from someone who voted only in 50% of recent elections, they might get a likely voter weight of 0.5. So you need to take into account that, but also, of course, new voters and what they might do. All of that, I hope, gives you the idea that this is a difficult thing to do in polling. There's a little bit of art and a little bit of science. Anytime you encounter a model, or you're building a model of an electorate or behavior, this is especially important politically because it's an era in which so few people cross party lines, right? You get more than 9 in 10 Republicans vote for Republicans, Democrats voting for Democrats. And so persuasion, while important, can often not be as important as turnout. Yes, the old cliche, it all comes down to turnout, but that's built into these polls. And so when you see things like last time in the midterms, when polling showed that if Democrats turned out more, they'd keep the House close, which in fact they did. That beat a lot of expectations, that beat a lot of punditry. That was where good polling data comes in handy. And you see the effects that that can have both in a poll and in real life when it all comes down to turnout. So that's a bit about how likely voter modeling works. And again, it's going to be important because the difference is when people start parsing 1 or 2 points, sometimes more, in the polling you're about to see is often because of differences in the way that pollsters model the electorate. And you should ask your pollster, how did you come up with this? How did you do this? And the good pollster should be able to explain it. That's one of the things everybody watching should demand as we go into this election season. Scott?
That was a very good explanation. Anthony Salvanto, thank you very much.
So, likely voter brings up an issue we'll talk a little bit more about coming up, and that is weighting. The statistical weighting that you do to figure that out. Bob, I think you mentioned that YouGov will ask you to say who you voted for in the last 3 elections.
It's not multiple choice. I happen to name the person I voted for the House of Representatives going back 3 elections.
Yeah.
So when I can't remember what we had for breakfast yesterday.
Yeah. So what that's doing is that's going a little bit further than just asking somebody how likely are you to vote, right? That's going back, and not only did he vote, but he remembered who he voted for, so that when they can apply a weight to that, I'm guessing that if there was 1 year that he couldn't remember, that would probably lower the prediction a little bit. So it's weighting is something that we do a lot of in market research. We'll look at a group of people and we'll say, what about this, if this person did this, how, and then we create a weight that indicates how they are different from some of the other people.
But isn't it who's selected? I never, in reading this and listening to you, I don't understand how they select these panels. You're weighting it when you select Bob. I mean,
I was
for
thinking
all
the
his
same
prejudices and opinions. So how do they select the panel so that it's evenly distributed or whatever?
So that gets back to the differences in the types of research that are being done. And we'll get to that in 1 second, so hold the thought. So conducting a poll requires 3 things, right? A set of questions to ask. That's the questionnaire. A set of people to interview, and that's the sample. A way of connecting the two, which is the mode of interview or the methodology. So conducting a good poll means doing the best possible job with all 3 of those elements. And that's where it gets tricky. So importance of questionnaire design. Well, that sounds simple, right? Somebody gives you a set of questions, and as a researcher, you put them all, you write them down, and interviewers ask them. Well, no, because for one thing, you want to put them in some semblance of order that has that flows, and that it's not asking a question at point A that they're going to want to really talk about at point E. So you have to think through what the client is wanting to get out of the whole thing. But the questions themselves have to be really simple, clear, and understandable. I'm really guilty of overwriting my question. So I have to send that to other people to edit. Do you get, I think it could be simpler, let's just say blah, blah, blah. Okay, fine, that works, yay. So that's an important aspect of it. You have to make it a question that people are going to understand. It also has to be meaningful to a broad range of people. That you usually can't test easily among your cohorts, among your friends, because they all kind of think, typically you'd expect they to think like you do. So what you do then is when you start a survey, you do a certain number of them in a slow start, which becomes your pilot. And in that pilot, maybe you do 60 interviews, and you then look at the data to make sure that it's making sense and that what you expect to see is there, not necessarily the yes or no's, but that people are able to answer. The other way you do it is you do that we used to do by telephone. It was much easier to be able to gauge whether people understood the question because you could hear it. And if they didn't, how many times have you been asked a question and the response list doesn't include your answer? And isn't that frustrating? So then, as a researcher, you try and always make sure that you have that somebody can fill in because that we understand that. So the questions have to be, and we touched on this earlier. The questions that they have to be things that people can answer, that they're topics they're familiar with. So you're going to today. You're probably not going to be talking about, asking Americans about something going on in some remote place in Africa, and asking them to give you an opinion about something. But you can ask them questions that relate to what's going on in their area or what they're seeing in the country. So that's the important part. And then the other part, this little demonstration kind of shows is that you have to be careful not to lead people to answer in a certain way. Agree, disagree versus an alternative point of view. So, for example, this was something along the line of, peace through you can gain world peace through military strength, and then this other question was part of a group where people could say, they could mark each item they agreed with. So you see the disparity, and this is the sort of thing that drives a researcher nuts. So like, how do I deal with that? There's 55% say yes for military strength, and down here, when compared to a bunch of other things, that's only 36%. So you have to think about the questions and what you want and how you want to be able to analyze it, because at the end of the day, the questionnaire starts backwards. It starts with what you have to be able to correctly analyze this research and understand what people are wanting. So
there's two questions.
Yes.
Kind of difficult. Somebody said earlier that I think probably today asked you how many times you voted or have you voted. It's like when I go to my dentist, I say, do you floss regularly? Oh, absolutely I do. I haven't used floss for 20 years, but I'm not going to tell them that. They can tell anyway.
Yeah.
I think we run the risk of people not wanting to say I don't vote, because that sounds un-American, sounds like you're not a good citizen.
That is an interesting point. It's one of the things that they have found because after 2016, organizations like Pew Research started running surveys side by side.
Mm-hmm.
They would test it online and they would test it by telephone.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the sort of thing that they found that people were and economic issues.
Mm-hmm.
People did not want to answer, or they were not truthful about.
Mm-hmm.
And there are certain things that they wouldn't be truthful online, because online gives the perception of greater anonymity. When you're talking to somebody on the telephone, it's, you're going, oh, they're going to think I'm a dirtbag or something because I said this. So that's an interesting change that they discovered as they morphed over to online. What was your other question?
The other question was, on this issue, I think I have a problem with that question because it says they're the best way. And in today's world, it's hard to find anything with the best way. Diplomacy may work in certain instances, it may work better with those. I mean, with a guy like Putin, diplomacy's not gonna work. You gotta think, let him think, you gotta do what you need. So that question is, when you ask people to pick the best way, I'm thinking, well, I could argue that both of them are the best way, depending on the circumstances.
Well, they might have in that question had both as one of the answer things. And I would be surprised if they didn't, but that was the example they gave.
Yeah.
And that would be a common problem in a questionnaire to do something like that. Any other comments about the survey design, things that you've seen in surveys that have frustrated you?
I got a survey the other day and it had my name, literally, in it.
Yeah.
And it was like, oh, I'm not answering the survey. I don't care. I'm sorry.
Oh.
You already have my name, so you have my opinion. And do I really want my opinion known? I mean, if there was no name on it, even though I had my email address, I might have done it, but my name was there.
Okay. Kathy, you looked like you had a thought on that.
No, I was just thinking, the real question is there bias in the question? And I noticed, I think that you got polled too. And they at the end always ask, for any of the questions biased? Did you feel the question?
Oh, do they ask that at the end of the YouGov?
They do. They give you a scale of essentially 1 to 4.
Huh. Wow.
And some of them, and they ask you how interesting what the survey was too.
Yeah. Huh.
And
Or did you have trouble understanding the question?
Yeah.
So they're trying to keep bias out by, seeing whether people thought some of the
I
questions.
think the other thing too is that there are voter registration
Data.
lists available. So like somebody came knocking on our door a couple of weeks ago on a Sunday morning, and I tried to be polite and shoot them away. And I said, well, I'm a registered libertarian. I don't know what you're talking about.
That usually gets them.
It usually did. And they dug in, and one lady said, well, that's exactly why we're here. We're here to change your mind. It's like, oh, dude, hey.
So Joanna, you're being awfully quiet.
Yeah.
Have you experienced surveys like that made you go,
No, I hadn't really seen any surveys. I get them in the mail, and they ask all these questions and then they want a donation, they're just saying, at the end. So I don't believe the survey. I just don't get much validity.
That's the trick on Facebook, where you'll see something there and say, what's your opinion on yada, yada, yada? And you click on one or the other, and then all of a sudden it goes on the screen, well, donate take your $50, or $19.95 every month or something like that. It's like,
that method of capturing is also used to capture people randomly to participate in surveys. We had to do a study in Saudi Arabia one time, and everyone in Saudi Arabia uses a cell phone, and there were no lists of people. And so we went to a firm out of Canada, which is probably being used a lot nowadays. And what they did was they put did an invitation pop-up, and then people would participate in the survey there. Believe me, it's really fun doing a survey in Arabic.
Lynn?
Yes?
I have a question about the two organizations we mentioned earlier for the industry. Have there been any generic efforts to try to convince the public that it's in their interest to take part in survey, to overcome some of the objections that we've been hearing in this workshop so far?
Roger, that's a good question. I think that, sometimes in the news media, they will say things like that. I would certainly say that, and I say that all the time when I'm presenting results of surveys to people. But I think that, but to answer your question, no, I do not believe that either of those organizations have done anything. I've never seen any advertising or anything like that. It would be really good if they did, especially now in a political season, to remind people to share your opinions and share let people hear your voice other than when you go to the ballot box.
Well, earlier on, the video of the situation in Britain mentioned the benefit to the candidates to know what the public might be thinking, and some of these slides are written to show the benefit to the candidate who hires the poll to know what the public might be thinking. So as far as we know, there's no effort to convince the public to take part, to overcome their suspicions and such.
Well, I wonder, as thinking about it, that, the question always comes up, well, they never call me, or I never get a poll, or something like that, that maybe they have determined that promoting participation in polls is not great if people aren't getting polls and they want, they're going to be suspicious of why they're not getting polls. But I don't know. I've never seen anything, Roger.
All right, thank you.
So that is, if people knew that organization existed, that they had standards, you can ask everybody who calls you, are you a member of this organization? But if they say no, click.
Yeah.
If they say yes, hopefully your comfort level will go up a little bit anyway. Like you say, but when you go, it surprised, and I'm sorry to go off on here, but Washington Post, ABC, and I forget the other two.
New York Times.
In terms, sounds to me like you should be right up top there because of the way you've experienced how professional they are.
Well, you'll see at the end, so hold on.
Sorry.
We got overachievers in this class.
And then you're talking about this, you get a better cross-section of the whole population if you do it online. The only way I would see, and you know how amped I am online, the only way I would see that if it came in on a direct email, and then as Teresa says, you've already got my name,
Well,
my email address.
Yeah,
So already you've slanted it.
yeah, so you're bringing a subject that I'm going to touch on here, it's very short. So Bob,
I want to make something with Jack had to say, you said about Saudi Arabia. So that project took maybe 4 to 6 months, I can't remember, a long time to get the questions just right. So I think market researchers really toil over making sure that they're asked in a way that doesn't exhibit any prejudice or something like that.
or bias, but there was a lot of argument over the translation too.
Every time I pick a translation.
Yeah,
Well, it's not just translation, but it's cultural there.
that was
You
part
were
of it.
one
That was a big-
to cultural.
Yeah, that was a big part of that issue, but it was a fun project. It was interesting.
I have a reluctance to share my opinion with anybody online because I feel them tracking me, just like I feel Alexa always listening in.
Or Google.
And so therefore, I just don't, it just seems like intrusive and that I'm going to be on somebody's list. And it's like Big Brother, watching over you and knowing everything. I don't like to put in all my personal information.
I think the
even
big
for
thing,
the card.
I think the big thing to watch out for
Yeah.
is probably not participating in these pop-up type of quizzes that or polls. You want to be invited to be a part of the panel. So that's a different process. And Bob has been invited to be, he's on their panel. If you're getting something that's just dropped on your email or it's on your Facebook page or you're on Google doing a search and it just drops in, that's just random. And yeah, I would probably be a little bit uneasy about that too. So, but anyway, especially now that we know what Google tracks everything that we do and all that kind of stuff.
If you don't have a VPN, nothing's private.
Yeah.
No,
So,
there isn't.
Doug, you just did a class on security online, and a VPN is a really good thing to have on your security on your computer.
But you also want to use a browser that doesn't allow tracking. Most browsers you can turn off tracking, for instance. What do you use for your browser?
Well, are you talking about like Google?
Yes.
Well, is that what your search engine?
Yes, that's
But
good.
the browser, like if you have an Apple phone, you're using Safari.
You're asking questions that I don't know.
Yeah.
I
You
have an
can turn
Android,
off.
that's all I can tell you.
You can turn off.
Yeah.
After class, if you want.
Yeah.
Yes.
About volume 2
Yeah.
on this, because I'm lost on that. I understand what you're
You
saying.
should have gone his class.
No, if anybody has
It's a good
questions
class.
after, I can help.
Yeah. So moving on, we've been touching on the importance of sampling. So what's interesting to me to look back at how things have changed, we changed to using panels early because that's the only way to reach the constituency that we focus on. Our clients are all in the scientific field, so we were typically looking for a very small group of people that are hard to find. But we can find them in a panel. But not the standard for decades was telephone interviewing, and we did random digit dialing. So you'd go to a firm that had all of the good phone numbers, and they would randomly select them, like every 99th number type of a thing, within the targeted population you were looking for. So it might be all the United States, it might have been Southern California, it might have been the Midwest, or who knows, it would depend on the study. And they would then deliver those numbers to your polling company, the people that were trained to be doing the telephone interviewing, and those numbers would just randomly come up. And back in the early days, they would have to punch the number in by hand, and then later on they became mechanized, like a robocall almost. So that's considered a probability sample.
So Lynn?
Yeah, Roger?
Oh, so I didn't mean to, sorry about the timing there, I didn't mean to talk over you. That slide kind of gets to my question again indirectly. Was there a golden age of polling, I mean, say in the last 50 years, where they were generally considered to be more accurate than they are today?
Actually, Pew Research did a study on that, and they found the polling today is better than what it was back in the day. But they were looking back, they went all the way back to, I think, the 40s. So they went decade by decade. And the margin of error went down as we get closer to today. So to answer your question. But as people stopped answering their phones, and as people stopped using landlines, it became more and more difficult to reach people. And the pricing on a telephone survey is based on response rate. So if they have to call more and more, if they have to call 100 people to get one respondent, then the price is going to go up. And especially if it's one respondent is qualified for the interview through the questions that you ask at the beginning. So that's what prompted the move around 2008 or 2008, something like that, was when more and more of the polling companies started migrating over to online. But they didn't do just online. Well, I'm going to segue here into the types of polling here, because that is walking us into the different types of polling. So margin of error. We often will see that talked about when people are talking about even these presidential polls. Oh, I see that we're going to have to hurry up. They're talking about, usually it's plus or minus 3% that they're talking about, because it's a sample size of 1,000 for a nationwide poll. Well, here's the problem with that. If you want to look at the difference between Democrats and Republicans, for example, that percentage, that margin of error is going to go down significantly, because now you're talking about maybe 390 versus 400, and that's going to be a margin of error closer to 7 or 8%. And then it's going, well, what use is this? And that's why they talk about ignoring the noise and looking at the long-term trend. Now, remember that that's margin of error as it represents the universe sample. That's not including the other sources of error that can be naturally in a survey, and they're very difficult to calculate. Methodology, telephone versus online versus paper, questionnaire design, placement of questions, question design, wording, all of those can add into error, and it's very difficult to calculate. So Pew Research says the true margin of error is really more like 6 to 7%, even on a nationwide poll of 1,000 people. So that's an important thing to remember. And it's not, Bob, you have a question?
A comment, there was a glitch with Verizon a couple of weeks ago, and that was in the middle of a UGO poll, presidential poll. And so in order to avoid a polling error, they opened it up to the sample size the next day to 12,000.
Wow.
And then I got a note back the next day and it said they expected their polling error to be absolutely minimal because the sample size was so small.
That's interesting. So there are ways of correcting for potential error. You can start prior to the start of interviewing by using screening questions. So for example, maybe you know that gender, women are a certain percent and men are a certain percent. If that's important to your study, you would ask that question up front. And if once you reach that quota, they would drop out automatically. But it's more likely, for example, in that YouGov study, they might be using questions about voting habits as a screener and you don't know it. Or there could be some additional questions that they ask, and sometimes you tell them thank you, but you're not meeting the requirements of our research. But I understand the way YouGov does, they push you into something else that's like a opinion study part, and then finish. The other way you can correct potential errors by pre-testing the questionnaire. We talked about that earlier. And then the other thing that's almost always done on these big nationwide studies is to weight the data afterwards to reflect the universe. And what they're doing is they're weighting it based on benchmarks. So they know, for example, they're not weighting it based on past elections. They're weighting it knowing what census data, or they're weighting it on other for example, Pew with their opinion research. They go back to government studies. So they know from government studies that are huge what the percentage of people are doing blah, 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 kind of a thing. So that's where potential error comes in. One of the problems prior to 2016, data was weighted only on age, gender, ethnicity, and location, geography. What didn't they weight on that ended up being the downfall?
Education.
Yep. And mainly because of a lot of Trump won and a lot of new Republican voters who, Democrats are known for a higher income and higher education voter than the Republicans are. Wait, I think I just did that backwards. I said that backwards. And Democrats are known for more of capturing the real people, the worker people and all that. Well, in this case, Trump brought in a lot of the worker level people with a lower education level and lower income, and they did not capture that. So now they ask education. I'm surprised they don't have income in that. Yep, fell asleep. Okay, so this is a question that you've all been touching on. The methods of polling matter. So this one, I found this immensely interesting because I would have thought that telephone polling, which is there at the bottom, would have the lowest margin of error. Because that's what we relied on for years. We all thought that was the only way to do it. And digit dialing, blah, blah, blah. It is the highest margin of error. Then the non-probability, which is online panel, which is a panel that is structured and people have agreed to participate in studies, all of those things, the margin of error is only 3.6%. And then when you get to a mix, and a lot of big polling companies are now doing a mix. So let's say you don't want to participate online, they will do a telephone interview with you. Or if you're invited to participate, and when they might send you a mail piece inviting you to participate, and they will give you several different choices of how you can participate. You can participate online, or you can call them. I got one like that not long ago. So I was fascinated with this to learn that especially the mixed polling was so important today to be able to have good polling results. So going back historically, in the 30s and 40s, in-person interviews were what you'd had to do. And then when you do that, you might help in participation because you might say, hey, oh, Doug, give me a second. I know you have some answers to these questions. But then you have that risk of interviewer bias. And then by the 1980s, the modes of interviewing were paper pencil surveys and telephone interviews. So I don't recall too many paper pencil surveys, but for political polling, it was all telephone interviews, and they were quick turnarounds, and we did a lot of rolling averages when we did that. Then my experience was on the political, on the politicians' side, the campaign side, not on what the news media was looking at and what normal people would see in the news media. I'm not sure that, I don't remember the polling results being such a big thing in the news back then. Do you remember that back in the 80s? That would have been like when Reagan, then Bush, Clinton in those days. But anyway, then by 2000, those surveys became the norm because they were faster and much less expensive. And now what we're seeing is the initial contact by phone, mail, or email, sometimes even a text with an invitation to participate. And some of those are to participate in the panel, some of them are to participate in an individual poll that some other organization is doing. So those are the ones where you hopefully, when they ask you to participate, they're saying who they are. But if they're not, I would just, no thanks, and move on.
But don't you think that inconvenience to you when the phone call comes is a big factor? I mean, they always call it dinner time because they know they have a captive audience. And you're distracted with other things. And
back in the day, we called on Friday nights because we knew we'd get a bunch of Republicans. So it was known, right? Drilled the industry. So you got.
I got a text message. Hello, Robert. INAPA is conducting a short survey on the issues important to you. Share your opinions. Here's the link.
And I didn't get one of those.
Yeah, sounds serious.
Alexa.
Yeah. So election polls today are conducted just like any other opinion poll, but this is where you can see graphically how polling has changed over these years. So even just in a short period of time from the year 2000 to 2022, which I guess I'm showing my age when I say, gosh, that was just yesterday. So we were doing live phone polling was the big thing back then. Then it changed, and then now look at 28% is doing online. Phone is only 4%, and and the number of active pollsters more than doubled, and the methods diversified. So what they found when it started going towards online opt-in only, the number of people doing polling really shot up.
Because you can do it at your convenience.
Yes.
At a time that's.
But the number of pollsters really jumped up too because it became really easy to do it. People would go and they'd use SurveyMonkey, or they'd put a poll and use a Google poll or something like that. Anyone could do it. So that started a whole round range of issues. Those polling changes that happened after 2016. So on the chart over there, that is something Pew Research does, and it shows you the benchmarking that they do, the types of questions that they benchmark against to make sure that their polls are accurate over time. Because they have these huge lifestyle polls that they do.
So, can you read that?
Let me do.
Just to give us an idea.
That's better, thank you.
Yes.
Yeah.
Help a little, I can't.
So that's just an example. But
Are you a US citizen?
yeah, are you married? Had high blood pressure. Household with at least one child received Social Security last year.
At the bottom of the list.
Yeah, can you reduce that now for me? Okay.
Use what? Thank you.
Yeah, so can you just reduce it?
Oh,
Because it's not really that important to this subject.
Thanks.
Thank you. So it led to a lot deeper research into why 2016 and 2020 seemed so weird. And really the net that they discovered after getting all of these about 20 different research organizations together and doing all this different research to look back historically and all this was that it turns out that let me get to this. Here we go. Turns out that the national polls were correct. The poll said Clinton up 3.3, popular vote was 2.1. What wasn't correct was the issue that we all were talking about earlier, was the electoral college. So though that's why we have swing states, we have states that are really important. Like, there's probably no reason for Trump to be campaigning in California. He's never going in California. Never. Not right now. Although Reagan had California back in the day. So it does change sometimes, but right now that's not going to be helpful. Are we right to be skeptical? Well, yeah, because polls that don't predict the results of an election, and they're not meant to predict. They're meant to track what's happening. Now, a poll is one moment in time. They usually close out after just a few days at the most, and online they're probably closing out overnight. So they're getting this. The tracking is, like she said in that first video, it's noise. You have to look at the long term. State polls, the reason they are off is because state polls are usually done by news organizations, regional news organizations. They don't have the budget to do polling. A simple poll of 400, 500 people is going to cost them $40,000. They don't have the money. And what happened with some of those state polls in the 2016 election was they came out, their timing was off, and the big move of all those voters veering over to Trump happened in the last week. So that is another issue, and there's polls can't really account for that. Let me see if I missed anything.
What do you think the impact of the weather's going to be on Florida?
I wondered about that because Florida and North Carolina, those are big Trump states. I don't know how he's going to get that. The potential problems of predicting a horse race. I think I said that wrong. Racehorse. Well, whatever. Racehorse winner. Anyway, I was still on drugs when I did this. But figuring out who is actually going to vote and how they're going to vote. The pollsters all use their own secret sauce to weight the likely voters. They put their heads together. So every time you see that Trump versus Harris poll result, depending on the study, the pollster, it's going to be a little bit different because their secret sauce is different. You can find out by looking it up and digging into it to find out how they are weighting to understand who are likely voters. And also differences in how they model the electorate. And how about new voters or undecideds or predicting the turnout? Those are all really, if I were doing political polling right now, I would be really focused on those undecideds because I know that Republicans are typically going to vote Republican. And I know that except for a 9% or whatever it is, and the same goes for the margin for Democrats. I would want to know all those people in between. That's what I'd be focusing on because no candidate is going to win without winning the undecideds. That's just simple math. So there are other potential problems with how the news media reports polls. And I got this information from the media. And they were admitting this, talking about this. So day-to-day reporting of results versus looking at the trends over time. I think some of the big polls, the ABC polls they're reporting over time. Focusing only on the data point and not on the issues. It's one of the other things I've been happy to see, that they've been reporting on the issues a lot and how people perceive the different candidates on those issues. Not incorporating quality swing state polling results for perspective. And that's hard to calculate into a nationwide poll. That requires you to be looking at statewide polls, because a nationwide poll is not going to look at, it's not going to have big enough numbers for the swing states. Otherwise it'd throw off the representativeness of the nationwide poll. And then the other thing you have to incorporate into how polls or media reports polls are the journalists' personal experience and beliefs. And that gets to what they say is wishful thinking and dismissal of what they are seeing. We probably saw a lot of that with Trump. Oh, that could possibly be right. So is accuracy harder to get? Yes, because it's harder to reach people. That's why they have, even with panels of people who have agreed to participate, it's hard to get them to participate, hard to persuade them to participate. And that's what prompted the switch really from telephone to online, because who wants to be interrupted during the dinner hour? Everyone has a different dinner hour. Some people are more likely than others to participate, and that leads to a potential for bias. So that's why you have to be looking at higher education income and balancing that against the population. So can we believe opinion polls today? There are errors, but when they're within a margin of error for each candidate, I'm not concerned about that. I'm just sitting there waiting until, talk to me a week before, maybe a couple of days before. Most polls are not, but think about this, that most polls are not about elections. They're about issues. And they want to know what you think. And that is really important. Even after somebody gets in office, polls give us an opportunity to tell them what they should be looking at. Most are used to capture views on those key issues, and they provide an independent source of information that we do not get from pundits, parties, and public officials. So this is 6 minutes. We're right at the time. I'm going to run it. If you have to go, I'm sorry, but I think this will kind of wrap things up for us. It's a post-mortem that Pew Research did.
Can we still trust polls? After the 2016 US presidential election, a common reaction from across the political spectrum was that polling must be broken. Now that researchers have had time to dig into what happened in 2016 and in polling more generally, we can bring a lot of data to bear on this. Here are the basics. Some people who were surprised by the outcome of the 2016 election still can't get past the feeling that they were led astray by the polls. But the fact of the matter is, the national polls in 2016 were very accurate. On average, the national polls indicated Hillary Clinton would win the popular vote by about 3 percentage points, and she won by 2 points.
When a commission got down to the data, looked at what happened in the 2016 election, they found most of the problems were actually at the state level, where there are folks who are trying to do this kind of polling with not the resources that you might have at the national level. What happened with some of those polls was they were out of the field and missed a late swing among those undecided voters toward Donald Trump. Or another issue they had was underrepresenting people who didn't have college educations. And all of those led to big surprises in the Midwest on election night.
Another common criticism is that pollsters favor a particular political party. But a look at the direction of polling misses in the U.S. over time shows that whether the polls tend to miss in the Republican direction or the Democratic direction is pretty much just a coin flip. Some of the best evidence about the performance of election polling comes from rigorous analyses of the accuracy of polls over time. If anything, national polling in presidential elections is more accurate now than it was a few decades ago. Since 2000, the average absolute error in national presidential polls has been around 2 or 3 percentage points, which historically speaking is really quite good.
And an even broader look at polling in 45 countries around the world over the past 75 years, done by Will Jennings and Christopher Walezian, found a similar result. Election polls worldwide have a good record of accuracy, and despite some forecasting misses of the past few years, the average level of accuracy has not declined.
While those overall trends are reassuring, unexpected election outcomes still rattle the public confidence in polls. A good example of this is Brexit. Believe it or not, Brexit was not a massive polling failure. While the betting markets in Britain did strongly suggest that Britons would vote to remain in the European Union, the polls were actually showing a close race. And for most of the final month, the polling showed Leave ahead. So while Brexit was certainly not a shining moment in the history of polling, it also wasn't an instance where the polls were wildly off.
Look, the fixation on election polls is totally understandable and probably unavoidable, but they're just not the best barometer for how good a job polling is doing. And that's because election polls have to do something that other polls measuring policies or attitudes don't have to do. They have to figure out, of the people they're talking to on the phone, who is actually going to go out and vote in some day in the future, and then how are they going to vote. And for those of you who have studied human behavior, even if it's just in your friends and family, you know that those kind of predictions are really hard.
While polls may not always be able to call the winner in very close elections, they remain very well equipped for reliably tracking the contours of social attitudes, measuring people's values, their preferences, priorities, and concerns. Take the trend over time in attitudes towards same-sex marriage. This is an example of polling not from an election where real-world events arguably validated the ability of polls to track real movement in public opinion.
You had different polling organizations using different questions to measure support for a legal right for gays and lesbians to marry, but all of them told the same story over time. Majority opposition in the 90s and early 2000s, followed by gradual gains in support through the last decade, and the emergence of majority support in recent years. And these trends were corroborated to some extent by the fact that supporters of same-sex marriage began winning statewide referenda on the issue about the time majority support emerged in the polling.
Another way to evaluate the performance of polls is called benchmarking. We take some questions asked in large federally funded studies with high response rates and ask those same questions in our regular polls. The difference between our poll numbers and the numbers from the benchmark surveys gives us some sense as to our accuracy. We recently benchmarked our telephone surveys against some high-profile federal surveys and found our polls get very similar numbers on issues like what share of Americans identify as Republicans versus Democrats.
And the same goes for what share of Americans identify as Protestant, Catholic, another religion, or no religious affiliation. In these analyses, the fact that the trends from the polls line up very closely with the trends from the benchmark surveys is evidence that the polls remain quite accurate. During the timeline shown, the response rate was declining, but despite what some people claim, the accuracy of these polls basically held steady.
Pew Research Center takes the accuracy of polling very seriously because we believe that polls have a very important role to play in a democracy. They're designed to give every citizen, whether rich or poor, well-educated or less educated, an equal voice. They also serve as a check on politicians on both sides of the aisle who could otherwise just claim to know what the public thinks or why they voted the way they did.
Now, that doesn't mean that people in government should be slaves to poll numbers or that all polls are trustworthy. But polls do perform a valuable function as a reality check on how the public is thinking about major issues and what's going well or going poorly in people's lives.
And even though some recent elections have put a spotlight on the limits to just how accurate polls can be, there is a lot of research showing that well-designed polls still work and still provide useful information. So bottom line, can polls be trusted? As long as we're realistic about the precision that polls can actually provide, yes.
What to look for in a high-quality poll? I know you've all been dying for this. So, first of all, who is conducting or sponsoring the poll? So that gets to your questions when you get somebody calling you on the phone or sending you an email or a text or something like that. It should say who it is, what the polling organization is. It won't say who the client is, it'll say the polling organization.
But if it's a call, you can ask.
You can, yep. And who was interviewed in the poll? Was it a nationwide study? Was it just people in Pennsylvania or what have you? how was the poll conducted? Was it done online? They'll usually say, sometimes they'll say no multiple notes. How were respondents selected? When was the poll done? How many people participated? Was the poll weighted? Almost all of them are statistically adjusted so that they're representative. And do the poll's questions look neutral and fair? Now, the only way you're going to be able to do that is to go to that poll. If you see it in a newspaper, for example, and you see who did the poll, maybe it's the ABC Washington Times poll or something like that. You can go Google that poll and find it, and then in that information for the poll, you'll be able to dig in and find out how many people, all those details. And they're important to know. But with some of these, if they're from this is the top 5 that 538 has judged, and they look at a list of about 50 different pollsters that are out there right now sharing their results. And what they do is they talk about how close, what their margin of error is, and they include whether they share their results with APOR, which is the governing organization that is sort of like a doctor submitting a paper for peer review in a medical journal. So New York Times, Siena College is at the top, ABC News, Washington Post, Marquette University Law School, UW, and Monmouth University Polling Institute. After that was a bunch of universities.
So if you're on the New York Times, say, I'm not going to read the top 2 because you don't read the New York Times.
I did this typo. I typed it in. I probably just didn't see the New York Times. Okay, yeah. Thanks for pointing that out.
Well, it has a reputation.
So wait a minute, but you guys, we can't talk all at once, or poor Roger won't be able to hear anything. So what was the comment over here?
I just said if you were a Republican, you might not believe those top 2 because my understanding is they don't trust the New York Times or the Washington Post. They like the Wall Street Journal. And
well, they're still going to if they're doing a nationwide poll, they are still they're finding enough Republicans to be represented. So, yes, a Republican might not agree with that, but if those I can
I hear what you're saying. And
but we will finish. So
when I hear somebody on the news talking about a recent poll, I don't believe or I don't recall them saying, and this was conducted by so and so. So
they do on ABC.
Okay, it's probably just gone over my head because
in fact, ABC will refer to polls that are otherwise. So wait, so there's a comment over here.
Oh, just mentioned it on NPR, they always say.
Yeah, Nancy, what was your comment?
No, I said they always, every time I listen.
It probably just, because now I know who are considered the top pollsters.
I'm on 538 right now, looking at Pete Gallegos versus Kerry Lake polling. Okay? There are 5 pollsters that have done this. Emerson College, SoCal Strategies, OMG Research, Redfield Strategies, anyway, so all of this. And if I'm a candidate, I think first of all, there's certainly a candidate first. The candidate wants honest feedback.
I'm sorry, but I'm not sure what you're referring to when you're saying these. What is this, a survey that's going on, or
this is a survey going on right now. It's a senatorial race in Arizona.
Yeah.
Okay? Vegas versus Lake. And so if I'm one of those candidates, I want to know what the heck's going on because they've only got a few weeks to go in. So at this point, Kerry Lake appears to be about 9 points behind. So does she throw in the towel or does she up the ante? If you look at back 1980 presidential race, about 8 weeks ago, Ronald Reagan was behind about 59 points. So did he amp up the effort to win the race, or did he just say, have heck with it? Lynn used to say something, she worked for Dick Worthland. And I remember reading Dick Worthland's biography, and he said the night of the election, he went to Ronald Reagan said, "Congratulations, Mr. President, you won the race." So I think that there's something to be said about how these, because I think Dick used to say, Windows says it better, but Ronald Reagan didn't want the polls to tell him what people wanted to hear. He wanted to hear what the people had to say to him. Is that right?
Well, that was in the day when some of the candidates really did want to know and did want to help.
Yeah, that was back when we weren't really marketing candidates. Now the candidates say whatever that people are wanting. So, I don't know where this keeps going back and forth.
Sorry, I'm trying to get her, while you guys are talking, we're trying to get her notes.
And Doug, you had a comment.
Whatever happened to Gallup? Used to be that it was over the Gallup.
I know, the Gallup, they're low on that list now. And I'm not sure why. Maybe the Gallup is focused more on doing market research because there's probably more money in that.
Oh.
There's a lot of money in a couple of months and political polling, but it's not the same. Now, to Bob's point, any candidate, even I couldn't believe the candidates in Orange County, California, were spending more than governors in some states on their last election. And a lot of that money is going to polling because they want to be able to, their team needs to understand exactly where they are and where people are in the issues and how they can, how they need to position them on the issues. One of the things that I found fascinating was Obama was the very first one who could target households. And used and they did some, that came up in afterwards when people were talking about the research that they did for him. Now, as we know, you can target individuals to find out what they think approval. So Roger, you had some questions early on. Have I answered them?
Yes, I have. You did. I appreciate your attention to those. I'm in good shape. I mentioned in my feedback that I wonder if there might be additional reading I could do to learn more about the what are considered failures of the 2016 and 2020 polling. Are they at the national level? That is, is the statistical difference between what was polled versus the outcome so significant that some of the companies have admitted that there are other factors that they did not mention or cannot mention?
So in answer to that, APOR put together a task force to look at the 2020 pre-election polling, and I do have the results of their what they released to the public of what they found. There's a big long one, and I just used a few of the pages, but I can send that out to everybody if you're interested. It's sort of a read, but if you're interested, if you're not, just ignore it. But I'll send it to Trina and to include in the handouts.
Thank you.
Sure. So any other questions? Did I answer all of your questions?
Yeah, you did a remarkable job.
Thank you.